Thank you all for coming. I hope continue to enjoy your tacos, and I'm glad you all could make it. And welcome. My name is Tim Carney. I'm a visiting fellow here at AEI. Welcome to our panel discussion. Timely topic: why does God hate America? The occasion for this is not the new steps we've taken in the decline and fall of the United States, in fact, but the publication of Red, White, Blue, and Catholic by our author here, Stephen White. Steve is a fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is a former pitcher and power forward on sports teams that I've played on, and he's a graduate of Catholic University for grad school and University of Dallas for undergrad. Here to comment on the book and the general topic of Catholic citizenship is Ramesh Ponnuru, also a visiting or fellow here at AEI. He's senior editor at National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg, among lots of other things, as well as a Catholic. So the book, which is out in the lobby, I've read. I endorse it. It's something of a primer on Catholic citizenship. It's great. For me, my favorite part was reminders of passages from encyclicals, arguments, distillation of arguments from various Catholic scholars and teaching. I think there's nothing heretical in the book, as far as I could tell. I am not granted the power to put the imprimatur on this book, but I want to get started first by asking you, Steve, what is the most important thing in this book that people either when they read it hopefully will get out of it?
Thanks, Tim. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ramesh. I think the biggest takeaway, and something I talk about, especially at the beginning of the book, is that Catholic social teaching is something we hear a lot about, but it's not always understood very well exactly what it is. Catholic social teaching is often taken to be sort of a bundle of doctrines, teachings, prohibitions, and exhortations on a variety of issues that touch on public policy. But what it really is not simply a bundle of sort of disparate ideas, but it's rooted in a vision of what it means to be a human person, and therefore to be a social animal, a social being. And it's a body of reflection, mostly by popes, on the theological and philosophical implications of what it means to be someone who is made for community, to be a person that's made for community. So that's fairly deep, and that's not always something that comes up when we hear about Catholic social teaching in the news. It usually has to do with, the Pope said this, or are Catholics in favor of that. So I wanted to establish that this continuity and this coherence, which is what gives Catholic social teaching its great worth, since it's not simply sort of the Catholic sort of party platform, but rather a coherent view of what it means to be a human person and to be a social being. It's because of that you can give us a distinctive view of what it means to be a member of a political community, to be a citizen. So I think that idea is really at the core, and then from there we work out into sort of addressing different areas of public life. But that's sort of the big takeaway.
All right, Ramesh, when you read this, what was most important, or the biggest thing nagging you, or the most heretical thing you found in there?
You are really into heresy hunting today. I did not notice anything heretical in the book. However, I have to say that I wasn't really looking for it. But maybe that's a defect on my part. I took away two things from the book primarily. One was a reminder that Catholic social teaching, with its emphasis on community, can be a useful corrective to the excessively individualistic tendencies that are sometimes, even often, found on both the right and the left, especially in our country. And I think he draws that point out quite well. And then second, there was an arresting and I think convincing formulation at one point in the book that the goal of good citizenship is not to enable good government. It's closer to the opposite, that the goal of good government is to make good citizenship possible. And that is closely tied to that first point because it envisions citizenship as being something broader than just voting, every 2 years or so, but really thinks of citizenship as having to do with the participation in the institutions of civil society. And I think particularly in this city, that de-emphasis on the narrowly understood political dimension of life is a useful one.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that jumps out at me is when you think about Christianity and the idea, and Catholics don't use this phrase as much, but a personal relationship with Christ, and that salvation comes on an individual level. And the whole history of the Catholic Church has monks, has people peeling away from the world and retreating. There are nuns who spend all of their time praying for us and not out there like the Little Sisters of the Poor serving us. And so that idea of retreat from society to spend time with Christ, with God, that's central to Christian history. Are there any problems, or when you hear people talk about a Benedict option, removing yourself from society as Saint Benedict did 1,500 years ago? How do you see this idea of removal and sort of individual relationship with God fitting in with your imploring people to be actively engaged in civic life?
Yeah, well, to restate the question, what happens when the demands of your faith interfere with the seeming, or at least apparent, demands of citizenship, right? I mean, that's the question that we build this as, right? Can Catholics be good citizens? I think there's a part of the book where I talk about religious freedom, and I shy away from talking about religious freedom in the ways that we usually talk about it, especially in this town. And I wanted to make the case that religion is a public good. It's not simply something that is sort of that the benevolent government allows us to indulge in. It's something that is a public good in the sense that without religion, at least insofar as it's true, without religion, the common good, the good of the whole society, will suffer. And it's not just because religious people do things like feed the poor and take care of the elderly. It's because there are certain aspects of human life that are proper to religious observance. And if those aspects of human life are missing, then the life of the community is incomplete. And those aren't things that the state can do. I buy into the definition of religion, the virtue of religion. I think it was Thomas Aquinas defined it as a virtue by which we offer to God what we owe to God in justice. Right? We are the creatures, he's the creator, and we owe him something, worship, namely. That's not something about which the state has much to say, one way or another, at least these days. And that's fine. But that doesn't mean that the state has to deny that that's an important part of the life of society. I think the Catholic view on citizenship has a way of relativizing the significance of politics. Not diminishing, but relativizing, which means that the ultimate horizon of human experience is not politics. That doesn't mean politics is unimportant. In fact, from a Christian point of view, politics takes on an even greater significance because what we do here in this world matters for eternity. Mm-hmm. So our interactions within the city, within the nation, are important and matter for eternity. But we are inoculated against making the mistake of thinking that politics is sort of the ultimate horizon of human experience, which is a rather truncated view of human life. So I think that view is a corrective to a view of citizenship as simply the stuff we do here together, and then that's it.
Mm-hmm. Since you brought up religious liberty, the book begins with the words, St. Thomas More was beheaded. So this was about a state redefining marriage is one way you could look at it. Love won in that case. But how much is is the, I mean, I guess you could talk about how you see St. Thomas more as a model for a society in which the state and Catholic Christian teaching conflict. But I'm also wondering sort of how much are we supposed to kind of expect, all right, maybe we have to be martyrs. Maybe our Catholic school is going to get shut down. Maybe I literally can't be a wedding photographer and a Catholic at the same time. And that, I guess, plays into the retreat. So either of you, sort of, what's your view on this? Do you see yourself sort of, that a lot of people are going to have to retreat from public life precisely because we have a state like Henry VIII that's bears antipathy towards Catholic teaching?
Well, first of all, that sentence is, well, true, that Thomas More was beheaded. That wasn't, I didn't write that. That's the introduction that was written by Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska. So just a shout out to him. Thank you for writing the introduction to the book. Having said that, I don't know if there's something you want to. Do you want to volunteer to be the
Well, I think what Tim is trying to do is to get you to write a sequel about how to thrive in the catacombs. But I think that you and I, and maybe even he, are hoping that we avoid that for the time being, at least. One thing that strikes me, it's when we think about religious liberty in an American context, the American version of religious liberty is a pretty Lockean version. It is about the individual. And if you actually go back to the source material, Locke doesn't particularly want Catholics to have religious liberty. The problem that is constantly created, and that I think you see play out in the contemporary context, is precisely this Catholic focus on the communal dimension of living out the faith. And so you have all these institutions like hospitals or universities that understand themselves as having, or are supposed to understand themselves as having, an apostolic mission, and that want to live out the faith corporately. That's a problem if you have a purely individualistic understanding of the faith where, well, that's fine. You can believe what you want to believe. That's something you talk about it at your home. It's something you can go to church and you can worship as you want, but you can't create these civil society institutions other than the church or the family where you're exercising this faith. And I think you're seeing that play out again and again. And it seems to me that the answer that Catholics and everybody really concerned about religious liberty need to make is not one of retreat. It is one of robustly standing for a kind of pluralistic social order in which it's not just the government and individuals, but you have a variety of different kinds of mediating institutions with different understandings the good society, all acting to live out their convictions.
Now, I just want to pipe in and say, yeah, I think that the arguments in this book exhorting us to engage in civil society more is exactly, as Ramesh is saying, what makes the tension between sort of the non-discrimination law and all that stuff and being a good Catholic is that I think that I've talked to liberals who said, you are totally free to be a Catholic as long as, that means praying as you will, maybe bringing up your kids as you will. What you do on Sunday is your business. And you even hear the telling rhetoric of President Obama, right? Freedom of worship instead of free exercise. And I think you're arguing here that the free exercise of being a Catholic would involve running hospitals, and that the ACLU suing to force the Catholic hospitals to abort the babies that come into that hospital, that is, this book is what makes the truce in religious liberty even more difficult, or at least a harder slog, no?
Yeah, I guess just to put a finer point on it, what I would say is what Catholics should be saying, and what our non-Catholic allies should be saying, isn't let them be free to behave according to their peculiar customs. Mm-hmm. But we should also be saying, let's try to build an attractive alternative to mainstream society. So it's not just a retreat, but it's a way of evangelizing.
There's a great temptation to talk about freedom, especially religious freedom, in a negative sense.
And I tend to do that.
Right. Well, and that's a useful way to talk about it. But as long as we don't sort of reduce ourselves to talking about it only that way, it is important to not have government intruding on things that it ought not to intrude on. Okay, so that I'm free from interference from the government or from whatever. And that's good. That's true. It's just that's not enough. And if the Lockean account of liberty is inadequate, then we need to come up with a better one. I mean, I don't feel beholden to John Locke in any particular way. I'm grateful in a certain sense, and he died a long time ago. I don't know why necessarily. But there is a certain. A lot of our conversations about these take place at the level of sort of ethics and morality. What ought people be allowed? What ought people to be allowed to do? What should they not be allowed to do? And that's important. And sometimes we get into questions of conscience and morality, and that's obviously an important part of this. But there, underlying these divides, and one of the reasons I think that our debates about these issues, whether it's religious liberty or debates about marriage or any number of issues that are particularly neuralgic, is that it's not just differing conceptions of morality, or rather, it's not simply differing sort of a different moral calculus. That's, two people are starting with the same premises and arriving at different moral conclusions that are in competition. The divides in our country very often demonstrate, if you dig deep enough, profound divides about what it means to be a person, what it means to be part of a human community. And sort of when your metaphysics are wrong, your moral arguments are going to sound incoherent, and I think we see that a lot now. Part of the if we see all sort of social authority, sort of all power in society as being essentially indeterminate, that there's authority and there's power, and that certain people have more or less of it, and certain people use it in certain realms in one or different way. So, but essentially, it's all the same kind of thing. It's just making somebody do something. Then we lose a lot of the texture of social life, and a lot of the texture of life that we would recognize as how we actually live our lives. One great example of this, and what I'm talking about is natural authority, which is sort of an anathema in the American conversation. That there are kinds of authority that are natural. I have authority over my children because I'm their father, not because the government decides that that's the best or most efficient way of raising children is to allow parents to have certain authority. I have authority over my children because I'm their father, because of the kind of relationship I have with them.
Because that's the most efficient way to raise
not
children,
because
is to allocate
not because
to
it's the most efficient way. If you could come up with a really, really efficient orphanage, it would still not be okay to take children away from their parents and raise them in a more efficient way. I think most people would agree with that on some level.
And those who would disagree disproportionately write for websites like Vox.com.
I've written for Vox.com. And I think that's a place to start. But this is a very difficult argument to make, even among people who are generally conservative, people who are generally sort of religious conservatives, even people who are Catholics. If we take an essentially utilitarian or instrumentalist view of human society, it creates a lot of problems for how we account for things like, why is family important?
Well,
why is marriage this way and not another way? Why is in our accounts of the realities of human life, a lot of the realities that people like us would like to see defended or promoted, we have a very hard time articulating the importance and significance of these institutions.
I think I have an instrumentalist view of government. At times, at least I do. That government is a necessary evil, that we need it for X, Y, and Z, and that it should do as little as it possibly can. At times in the book, you argue about sort of government having a natural and even at times absolute authority over some aspects of civil life.
I don't know that I argue that it's an absolute authority. But
I mean, it didn't mean absolute, ultimate.
Government is not a necessary evil. It's a necessary good. That's that's an Aristotelian view, right? We are by nature political animals. If the polis is part of our nature, political authority is natural to human beings. That's not a bad thing. Now, the state can do all kinds of bad things. You'll get no brief from me on that. But we can't simply stop there and say that there's the individual and there's the state, and then our politics very often becomes a tug of war between the two. I talk about this in the book, that our politics is sort of, you see increasingly, it's a little bit weird this year, but you increasingly see, at least in the parties as they were up until yesterday, so you get this sort of this party of the individual and this party of the state, and that's neither one of those is really quite accurate description, but that's the dynamic in our politics as it plays out. You saw this in 2012. I use this example in the book to tell a story. You had the infamous Barack Obama says, "You didn't build that," right? His point was actually true, and if in a different time and place said by someone else, it probably would not have received much comment. Basically, he said, there's no such thing as a purely self-made man. It was his point, right? You were taught by somebody. You were formed by somebody. Someone built the roads that brings the business to your.
Well,
okay, fine.
As I recall it, his point was actually that you should accept higher taxes.
That was his point.
He was getting to that, and this was also coming from a man who I think was a little bit later than this. But at Charlotte, we saw the video. The government is the one thing we all belong to. Or Barney Frank's favorite. Government's just the name of the things we decide to do together. Okay, well that's just the blarney, right? That's not true. And the response from the Republican side was not, "Hey, look, yeah, we're responsible for each other and we depend upon each other socially, but that doesn't mean that government is the means of our dependence and responsibility for one another." But that's not the response that came. It wasn't an argument for civil society that was the answer. What we got instead was essentially, "Yeah, I did build that," and so and in the middle is this huge gap in our politics and in our social life where most of our life actually happens. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, was to say, between the individual and the state is sort of, we focus on the individual state in our politics, and in the middle is where most of life happens. It's where most of our citizenship gets done, where most of our, being responsible for others, teaching other people to be responsible for others, learning to be responsible, to be truthful, all this stuff. All of that happens in between me alone and the government. And our politics ignores that huge space, and it's really unhelpful. And I'm waiting for someone to maybe not this election cycle, but I'm waiting for someone to show up and say, "Hey, look, it's not all about the individual and the state. There's a lot more to our social life that needs caring and looking after."
The Republican convention last time was sort of dedicated to the idea that we should be a society of Randian supermen. I suppose that turned out not to be a winning political platform. I guess I would just say that this point that we're making about civil society and the mediating institutions and their role being something of special concern to Catholics, that dimension of Catholic thought has historically been considered to be a kind of problem with respect to American citizenship, right? I mean, the idea that there's a tension between the Catholic faith and American citizenship is certainly not something that has just recently developed because of the modern welfare state and social liberalism. The whole impetus behind the Know Nothing's anti-Catholicism was that you people have divided allegiances. You are you don't just have these beliefs, but you are also corporately part of an institution that is organized on non-liberal and in some respects anti-liberal principles, and they were not completely wrong about that point. And so I think the contemporary controversies we have find a distant echo in some of that history.
Steve, are you now or have you ever been a subject of a foreign leader? I mean, what are we supposed to do?
I have to think
Pope
about that. But
versus...
you bring up a good point because there is a difference. A colleague of mine, George Weigel, wrote a column for today flogging my book. Read his column. I'll tell you to read my book. But he makes a point that anti-Catholicism in the United States is a little bit different now. This idea that Catholics are subject to a foreign sovereign is, I guess, technically still true in a sense that the Pope is the sovereign of the Vatican City State. but he doesn't have an army. He doesn't have fleets at his command, which was the case 150 years ago. And so there was a certain one element of anti-Catholicism in the United States historically was this idea that there is a foreign potentate who is going to tell you what to do, and you have to pick between them. That really isn't the problem. I've never heard anybody in contemporary circumstances object to Catholicism in American life on the grounds that, if the war breaks out between the United States and the Vatican, you might, be spying for the other side.
They already built their wall.
They do have a wall. The Leonine Wall was actually built to keep out Muslim raiders, if you want to make that sort of even more interesting. That's a true fact. But I think there is an aspect of, as you said, this corporate identity. And it's not just Catholics. You see this with the LDS. I talk about solidarity and subsidiarity in the book. I talk about a lot of things in the book. It's actually quite short and fairly readable. So I don't want to. It has the virtue of brevity, I tell people. So this idea that we take corporate. I don't mean corporate. Yeah. Finance. I mean in the proper sense, corporate responsibility for one another that does not necessarily involve the state. You see this done very well by the Mormons in Utah and in other places that they care for each other. They do it better than anybody these days. And that doesn't always go over real well. But if the alternative is, the only thing that we do together we call government, I'm willing to make that case, and I think people will come down with let's leave it to the people to regulate their own social lives, at least in part, on their own without expecting.
Well, let me ask you about, you mentioned Utah. So I look at Mormons, I look at Orthodox Jewish communities. Even I went up to the Dutch towns in Wisconsin, and I saw this really strong social cohesion. And one of the ways I measured it was by inverse relationship to how much they voted for Donald Trump. Because civil society falls apart, you look for somebody to piece it back together, be a strongman. There's all sorts of political interpretations I could do with that. What I couldn't find was the Catholic place where the social cohesion was really strong. I mean, I'm sure it exists. Maybe it just wasn't in any of the states that I was looking at the time. You look at Massachusetts. I mean, all these Irish Catholic guys from Lowell, Massachusetts, are voting for Trump. You look at New York and Staten Island. Every Irish cop I grew up with, they are coming from places where they say there's not a strong sense of social cohesion anymore. That's something they remember from when they were kids or their parents. So, I mean, does it exist anywhere? Do I have to go to Malta to find it? What?
This is one of the really big questions about Catholics in American life. Not do we fit as citizens, but are we really distinct in the way we live our lives anymore? I would like to think that we are, or that we can be. I certainly think we ought to be. If we're just simply a mirror reflecting back to society all of its sort of flaws and virtues and vices, then we're not really doing what we ought to do as citizens, let alone as Catholics or as Christians. In 1960, something like 80% of Catholics in the United States voted for John F. Kennedy. Since the early 70s, and you might actually know the numbers on this better than I do. I mentioned them in my book, but Ramesh's book, The Party of Death, read it. Since the 1970s, that's really changed a lot, and I think it has. I think it has a lot to do with the Democratic Party becoming the party of social liberalism. The economic liberalism or progressivism was very much something that appealed to most Catholics, blue-collar Catholics, especially in the Rust Belt and the big cities of the Northeast. As the Democratic Party became more increasingly the party of social liberalism on issues like abortion and then more recently on things like marriage, it alienated a lot of Catholics. And it's not just sort of conservatives making this case. Democrats for life, after the 2014 midterm elections, came out with a scathing press release that basically said, if Democratic Party is uniformly pro-abortion, we will never again retake the House of Representatives. And they showed the decline of of the number of Democrats in the House of Representatives compared to the number of, and almost all of the decline from the 1970s in congressional Democrats is pro-choice or pro-life Democrats. There are almost no pro-life Democrats left in Congress, almost none. And their disappearance accounts for, according to Democrats for Life, accounts for almost all of the decline in sort of Democratic control of the House of Representatives. So you've seen this balancing out. So Democrats used to be basically the political home for almost all Catholics, and now it's more or less a wash. So the question is, now is the Catholic vote a bellwether, or is it just simply indistinguishable from the rest of the country? I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it's both in a sense. Whoever wins the popular vote at the national level tends to win the Catholic vote by the same amount, within a percentage point or two, going back 5 or 6 presidential elections. Maybe not 5 or 6, but 4 or 5.
So pulling out the Catholic vote is like pulling out a random sample.
Yeah. There's almost a difference. There are differences in church attendance, but those don't have to do specifically with Catholics. That's sort of across the board for all denominations. And we'll see. 20 years from now, perhaps the shift continues, and being Catholic, which was once an indicator of voting for Democrats, will be an indicator for voting for Republicans. The way it's going, I don't see that happening. But it might just be that Catholics are so assimilated into American life that you can be a vocal, self-described faithful Catholic and hold positions as disparate as Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi.
Well, let me make a couple points about Catholic voters and the Catholic vote, to the extent that there is one. It is true that the Catholic vote tends to go with the overall vote, and people sometimes, from that fact, conclude that Catholic voters are just like everybody else in this country. But it's actually that's I think just a mistake, because it's not true that most voters are always with the winner, in the sense that. Like most people actually are either always voting Democrats and always voting Republican, and sometimes they're winning and sometimes they're losing. Most blocks of voters, you've got the same pattern. Most Jews always vote Democratic. A majority of Jews always votes Democratic. A majority of evangelical Protestants always votes Republican. A majority of whites always votes Republican. A majority of blacks always vote Democrat, et cetera, et cetera. Catholics don't always vote for one party or the other. They are a swing vote, and that makes them distinctive. And second, they swing more than the popular vote overall. That is, if you've got an election where, compared to the previous election, there was a 3-point swing of the overall popular vote from one party to the other, there'll be a 5-point swing of Catholics. So they seem to be kind of leading and not just following public opinion writ large. I wouldn't want to make too strong a connection here in saying, well, Catholic teaching doesn't fit totally comfortably in either party, and neither do Catholic voters, and it's just a one-for-one correspondence between those things. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were a connection.
So we've got almost half an hour. I'm going to want you guys to think of questions. I'm going to open it up for that in 1 minute. But I just we're talking about elections. Did the Pope tell us not to vote for Donald Trump? Is that what he said? And in general, you don't address voting in this book as a point, as a deliberate point. But, I mean, can the Pope tell us how to vote or not vote? Does Catholic teaching tell us how to vote or not vote, specifically in this election and more broadly?
The Pope did not tell people not to vote for Donald Trump. I wouldn't expect. He explicitly said that he doesn't do that. And if he did, it's doubtful that would be binding on the conscience of the Catholic. So, that's a big. It's kind of funny when it comes to Catholicism and politics. There's a sort of ironic. It's often taken that Catholics are really beholden to doing what they're told by the Pope or by their bishops or by people like us. But they're really not, in the sense that, not that we're not beholden to the Pope, but to the teachings of the Church. But there are relatively few things that the Church sort of dictates. You must do this. You must not do this.
Everything really, fits into prudence.
Really, fairly few, which is one of the reasons why you see Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan being sort of public examples of what it means to be Catholic. I'm not suggesting that there's a moral equivalence there, or that there's not problems that Nancy Pelosi has that Paul Ryan doesn't also. I'm just there's this. If you want to look for who is the exemplar of what it means to be a Catholic in public life, you're going to get a lot of different answers from a lot of different people.
And so, speaking of the Catholicism on the left, I want to ask you about the kind of commie stuff that you put in this book. The private property comes with the moral obligation to use that property in accord with the common good. When individuals fail in their duty to use their wealth for the sake of others, it invites the intervention of the state. I mean, that sounds kind of scary, Bernie Sanders type stuff. Am I not using my lawnmower, or my Keurig 2.0 for the common good? And is the government going to come and seize them or dictate how I do it?
Well, I know you're joking, but well, sort of. But you actually made a jump there that a lot of people make. It's a non sequitur that happens in our political discourse all the time, which is if someone says that if I say the right to private property is not absolute, and that you have an obligation to use everything that you have for the sake of your good, the good of those for whom you are responsible, and the good of the whole community.
And the government can intervene.
People assume that means that the government should dictate to you, or maybe do for you, the distribution of those goods. And I think almost everybody would agree that government has at least some role in doing that. Taxes are not theft, right? I don't think that there are certain public goods that
in some circles in Washington he'd be getting stuff thrown at him right now.
Sure, but when the government taxes me or anybody else in order to raise an army or do all the things that are outlined in the Constitution, it's not violating my property rights. But there is an assumption that
to hire the lawyers who force nuns.
Anytime we talk about, and this is a symptom of our divided politics. Anytime we talk about corporate responsibility, or even sort of dodgier terms like social justice or the common good, which are actually terms of art in Catholic social teaching that don't mean exactly what we hear them to mean a lot. Anytime someone talks about social responsibility, the fact that I don't have an absolute, that the right to private property is not absolute, that I do have an obligation to use the material goods that I own for the sake of others, and I can't just dispose of them however I want. The assumption is that the sole and necessary regulator of that is government, and that's just simply not true. There are more laws to which I am beholden than just the law of the state.
But you say the government has ultimate responsibility for the common good, and if I'm not using my private property in accordance with the common good, that the government has a right to intervene. And so...
Yes,
tell me how that manifests itself when a just government is intervening in that case. How would that manifest itself? How would that show itself in real life?
When a just government intervenes to
say,
distribute, our government
is it just taxation?
Our government does it all the time, and not always justly. Is it just taxation? Well, let me give you an example. So I don't know what the exact number is right now, but state, local, and federal governments in this country spend something like 35 to 40% of GDP. Okay, most of that is basically redistribution.
Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare.
Yeah, or redistribution. That's not sort of handing out cash or goods or services, but it would be infrastructure, all the kinds of sort of public goods that we all benefit from that the government pays for, sometimes by taxing, sometimes just by borrowing. Okay, now I can say that government ought to be doing some of that, without saying that it ought to be doing all of that. And what you have now is that anybody who says, hey, look, maybe 40% of GDP is a little bit more than government should be doing, the assumption is that you think government should be doing nothing, which is not, reducing government spending or government involvement in social life from its current level is not a minimalist or even a libertarian account of what government ought to be doing. It's just saying it's too high. But often, when conservatives say the government's doing too much, our opponents will say, well, you don't think government should be doing anything. You're anti-government. You think that the state has no role to play in maintaining social stability and programs like Social Security, and you're anti-government. And rather than saying, no, obviously I'm not, when Paul Ryan, who's proposing multi-trillion-dollar budgets that increase over time, is being accused of social Darwinism, this should be a pretty easy charge to refute. And yet somehow we often fall into the trap of defending the straw man, which I don't see why we do that.
So another example that may help illustrate the point, I believe that there is catechetical language about the existence of a right to health care, which does not, I think, imply that the government has to directly provide the health care, that the doctors and nurses have to be working for the government, for example. It may be that the government can fulfill its obligation to see to it that everybody has the health care that they need, or that it can fulfill its obligation to create an environment conducive to everyone having decent and affordable health care by creating the right incentives for private actors. And there's just a huge role for different Catholics of good faith to reach different conclusions about the best institutional arrangement and the best mix of private and public institutions to attain that goal.
But the very unlibertarian point that both of you are making is that if there is something like a right to health care, that ultimately the government sort of has a responsibility to make sure somebody is carrying that out. Is that correct?
It may fall to government to do that, but before Obamacare, we had that. We had good Shepherd laws where if I walk into the emergency room and I'm bleeding out, the law requires the medical staff to treat me.
Yeah.
Federal law enacted under Reagan.
Right. That's a good law. That's not the American Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. And Donald Trump agrees people should not be bleeding on the street. Yeah.
Well, that's one thing Donald Trump and I
mostly because it's disgusting.
Right. For public health. But there is assumption, and it's widespread on both the right and the left, that when we talk about sort of the administration of public goods, and those are all lowercase letters, that we mean government. And I think that's a big mistake. There are lots of social obligations that are incumbent upon us as citizens to meet that don't necessarily require government. If we assume that things we do together involve the government, we're conceding a huge point to the people who think government should do most about it.
And that's both a Barney Frank point and a sort of hyper-individualist point. All right, I want your guys' questions, comments, arguments, anything like that on any of these topics, including, politics, economics, religious liberty, whatever. Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot. We got a microphone guy coming your way, right up here with the hat. Microphone guy is going to come your way. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Thanks. Elizabeth Graham. You had said that private property is not an absolute right, and that if it is not used for the common good, that you would argue, at least Timothy said you did argue, that the government has an obligation to intervene. Could you define how you would know what criteria you would apply, or who you think would appropriately apply criteria for determining whether it is being used for the common good?
That's a really complicated question to answer. It would depend. This is one reason it's important to have good statesmen, because there's not a clear-cut answer. There's no principle that decides that. I think on the fringes, it's easier to come up with examples where, if there's a drought and somebody's hoarding all the food and won't give it to anybody, okay, well, are we going to let the population starve, or are we going to confiscate some of this food? A really extreme example. Examples so extreme they don't often happen in this country at this time in history, to be honest.
If you have a life-saving drug and you own the patent on it and you're going to charge exorbitant amounts, that could be considered such an abuse of your privacy.
Yeah, you're right. But what is the appropriate response that respects? Because to say that property rights are not absolute is not to say that they're non-existent. They're real, and they are, according to the Catholic Church, natural. They arise from our need to be able to fulfill our obligations to ourselves and to those around us. But what exactly how to balance property rights and the needs of the community is not something that permits of a simple, easy answer. And it's something we should debate about. Often our debates assume that it's either all or nothing, which isn't very helpful. And it's especially not helpful when the debate itself that we should be having is actually a very complicated and difficult one.
So in the case of the life-saving patent, the considerations that we would bring to bear on the question of what to do would include, what's going to happen to the incentive to create more life-saving drugs if we infringe the patent? How many people are going to suffer if we don't infringe the patent? But one thing that would not be a consideration is, there's just an absolute right to this patent, and it is in principle just never right for the government to infringe it. That, I think, that sort of absolute property right is what the church and Stephen are correctly denying.
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say that it would depend on what the medicine does. I mean, is it a medicine that really meets a widespread and basic need, or is it some sort of, a drug that makes you regrow your hair? I mean, there's a difference, even what the drug is itself. Is this a really genuine medical need that's being denied unjustly to people who are suffering because of it, or is it something that's more or less a luxury? That would be part of the consideration, too. So
Well, you say that with a full head of hair, I notice.
You haven't seen
you're
the
not
overhead
tall
camera
enough to see
shot.
the top of my head.
Yes, over here. Then the microphone is coming from behind you.
Tim had said something about that ultimately it would fall to the state if say a property right is not absolute, and that some decision has to be made as to whether it's being used for the property is being used for the common good. Is that part of the problem here? The question of if it ultimately falls to the state, then that implies that the state has whatever power is needed at the end if all else fails. And really the question is, ultimately the power falls to society, and the state is just one of the things, the powers of which are limited.
Yeah, to say that the state is okay. So let me clarify this first. The state is, of all the institutions that are in and among society, the state is the one that is primarily responsible for the whole, because it's the only one that is adequate to the whole of the political community. Okay, which means that when it comes to the common good, the good of the whole community and all of its parts, that the authority responsible for that most directly is the government, the state, the nation, okay, the polis, whatever you want. Okay, that doesn't mean that it is the arbiter of every dispute involving property and whether or not it's made for good reasons or bad reasons. There are all kinds of decisions about the use of property, private or otherwise, that are made by non-state actors, okay? I'm the one who decides who gets the last bowl of Cheerios in the morning, right? It's not the government's job. I'm the one who decides all kinds of things, of how things get distributed and allocated in my house. Within the parish, there's all kinds of decisions about which, who gets the tuition break, who gets, this distribution of food from the food bank. There are all kinds of decisions about the allocation of property that are not really the business of the state. So to say that the state ultimately is responsible for the common good, and part of that responsibility may involve the allocation of property, is not to say that the state is responsible for all property and it allows us to do most of the allocation of property sort of out of efficiency. Does that distinction make sense? So to say the state is responsible for the common good, including the distribution of property, is not to say that the distribution of property is the role of the state, and anybody else who's doing it is sort of acting as a deputy of the state. Those are two very different things.
But
I don't know if I'm answering.
what you're saying is that sort of somebody who, it sounds almost like you're saying the state can delegate these authorities further down. But I know that
explicitly saying that it's not delegated.
But if you say they're ultimately responsible, but it might not be their job, how is that different than saying that
let me use a different example that doesn't involve property. I already touched on it. The state, I'm responsible for my children, and I have authority over my children by virtue of being their father. Okay. Now, if heaven forbid my wife and I die, okay, it may be necessary for the state to step in and provide for the good of the children. Not because the state is really good at being parents, but because there's no one else to do it, and it's not being done by anybody else. Okay. This is one of the things we talked about where when civil society fails to do what it ought to do, when it fails in its responsibility, it leaves a vacuum. And often what we see is this, someone has to step in to provide stability or continuity in the community, and often that falls to government. And sometimes the government can do that and then step back and allow civil society to come back in and fill the gap once the emergency is over. Among conservatives, we often complain about government intrusion into realms where it doesn't belong. That's absolutely the case. It happens all the time, and it's a bad thing. And it leads to the atrophying of civil society. But there's another side of that, which is that civil society, when we say, you know what, my life would be more difficult if I took care of X, Y, and Z, the state's willing to do it, I'll let them do it. When we abdicate our responsibility at the level of civil society, we invite government to do things we should be doing.
It's a backstop or a safety net. So that's not that it's allocated, that it's delegating it temporarily to parents or whatever, but that it's there when the proper authority isn't taken care of.
Yeah, and there are examples of Catholic social teaching where the church exhorts the political authority to make these kinds of interventions as brief and temporary as possible so that they don't start taking over things that they shouldn't be doing.
All right, ma'am there, with the sunglasses on her head.
That's how I like to be known. Francine McKenna. Just one added point on yours. Also, the state intervenes when people violate the social contract. So, for example, if you were to abuse your children. So not just a benign application of your responsibility.
Exactly.
I'm sort of curious as to some of the basic teachings of Catholic social thought, like feed the hungry, clothe the naked, have compassion for the sinner. In discourse, whether it was the Pope saying it or other political figures saying it, it got characterized as communism. What's happened here? Where did we lose, sort of that thing that like I was raised on?
I don't know where we lost it. I mean, there was a remark that Pope Francis made in a document that simply allowing the market and nothing else, nothing other than the demands of the market, to regulate economic life. So radical market liberalism, in the older sense of liberalism, radical libertarianism, is not enough to ensure that we will have a humane and healthy economy. Okay. Rush Limbaugh called him a Marxist for that. That point is, people in this room may disagree, that point is not only true, it's obviously true. It's obviously true. If the only limits on economic activity are what the market will allow, then almost nobody agrees with that. Almost no conservatives agree with that. And someone may say, the Pope was attacking a straw man, right? There's no place where this pure, perfect economic freedom exists. Okay, fine. If he was making a point, why defend the straw man then? I mean.
And I think that's right. What happened here is I think you saw this reaction, back and forth reaction, where, you could even see it almost as a diabolical plan of liberals who make conservatives become extreme individualists.
Into defending positions that we don't actually hold.
And especially on economics, yes, I built that. Nothing is more inherently communal than engaging in commerce. The com is in the word commerce just as much as it's in the word communist.
There is also this. The person of Pope Francis is a different topic in his pontificate.
We've got 6 minutes.
Right. I only need 4. So there is a tendency to assume that when the Pope, and particularly this Pope, I think, says something about our social responsibilities, that he is speaking as a political actor to a political audience. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't assume that things he says are meant to carry political implications, because I think clearly they do. But there is a tendency, and this is on both the right and the left and the center, to assume that the categories of American politics, right, left, economic liberalism versus state interventions are the appropriate categories for understanding what Pope Francis is talking about on any number of issues, or any other churchman. And that's simply not the case. We are listening to a man with talk about things that are important, but we're listening to him as if we're listening to Fox News or MSNBC, and we misunderstand him in part because of that. That's not to say that we're making things up when we think that he's talking about things that politicians should be doing to regulate the economy or to fight global warming. He clearly says those things, but they're not the words of a political ideologue, for example. I'm sure the guy has pronist tendencies, but he's not a communist. He's not saying these things because of a political ideology. They may be colored by his politics. I'm sure they are, whose opinions and statements are not. But they're not coming from the place of political ideology.
Conservatism and libertarianism, I think, have a tendency or a weakness for theoretical maximalism that leads them into all kinds of errors. And it goes way back. I mean, if you think back to Frank Meyer, great founding father of American conservatism, he has a stray remark somewhere about the, quote, totalitarian implications of the school lunch program. I think that that tendency was accentuated in the early Obama years when you had this kind of collectivism on the march, and you had this kind of hysterical rhetoric of commercial individualism that arose in response to that. And I think that you didn't build that was part of it. I think that Rush Limbaugh's discussion of the Pope's Marxism has been part of it. And I think that if maybe Rush would read Stephen's book, he might see that
And recommend it to
that the worthwhile defense of free institutions that in which Rush wants to engage would be strengthened by engagement with this kind of thought, because your points would be more defensible.
Yeah, I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask the last question and go back to my joke at the beginning, which was, why does God hate America? You quote Charles Carroll, founding father, Catholic, without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. You quote George Washington, denying or rejecting the idea that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. The religiosity is falling in the United States, especially among our leaders. Have we ever had two nominees who don't ever attend religious services? I don't know, maybe we have. And without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. A lot of conservative Catholics would argue that as a society, there are people who have morals, lots of them, but as a society, we don't. I mean, do we have morals? Do we have enough religiosity to sustain what morals we have left? And is our republic going to subsist for any significant amount of time?
That was more than one question.
So does God hate America?
The jury's out on that one. I think conservatives for a long time have been talking about the need for us to take seriously the formation of citizens. That only a people possessed of certain virtues will be capable of living freedom well. This is an old idea. We don't hear about it as much as I think we ought to talk about it. It's an idea about which the Catholic Church has a great deal to say. A lot of religious traditions have something to say about it. It's an idea that was very near and dear to the founders, that they were emphatic about the inadequacy of our government to producing people capable of living well under it. It was the subject of Abraham Lincoln's first public address and his Lyceum address, worrying about the perpetuation of our political institutions. And what does it mean to have a people with the character to maintain and pass on the best of our political institutions? So, the question, are people, we see the rise of the nuns, we see the decline in religiosity. I don't think that we can give into sort of this determinism. I'm not. I have Polish friends who joke that an optimist, a pessimist is someone who says things can't get possibly worse, and an optimist is someone who says, "Oh yes, they can." So I'm an optimist. But whether we will succeed in saving the republic by teaching our children to be good, upstanding citizens, I don't know, but we have to try anyway. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball to see into the future, and it's not. Despair does nothing for us. In fact, I mentioned in the book, despair is a sin, and to despair of grace and the intervention of grace in our lives is not a good thing. And so we keep up the work. We keep up the work of trying of first insisting that freedom cut off from the truth is not actually freedom. That license is not a solid foundation for self-government. And we do the hard work of teaching and forming the next generation, and of defending and building up those institutions where those little platoons, as Burke called them, where we learn responsibility for one another, where we learn how to live our freedom well, we learn all the virtues that are necessary for Republican self-government. And we might fail, but we have to do it, and we'll continue.
I just get a strong sense that Tim wants us to end on a down note, so I'll provide it. God loves each and every American. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, very much included. But as Catholics, we believe that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. We are given no such guarantee about the United States of America. To put the same point in more secular terms, we talk about our country as an experiment. Well, it's in the nature of experiments to fail.
And on that note, Steve, for a few moments, will be outside signing copies of the book. Thank you guys all for coming.